June 6, 1944. D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted. When we think of that day, we picture infantrymen packed into small landing craft, racing toward the beaches of Normandy under fire. But wars are not won by riflemen alone. A modern army is not just flesh and courage, it is steel, fuel, wheels, tracks, and logistics. It is tanks, artillery, trucks, bulldozers, medical vehicles, and the endless supply chain that keeps them moving. In 1944, all of that heavy, war-winning machinery was trapped on the wrong side of the English Channel. Moving it across open water was easy. Putting it ashore under fire was the real problem. The solution to this seemingly impossible challenge came in the form of one of the ugliest, slowest, and least glamorous ships ever to fly an Allied flag, the landing ship, tank, the LST. To the men who served aboard them, the initials jokingly stood for Large, Slow Target. It was an awkward, slab-sided vessel that looked more like a floating warehouse than a warship. And yet this ungainly ship was a weapon of extraordinary strategic importance. It solved a problem armies had struggled with for centuries: how to land a fully mechanized force directly onto a hostile shore. The LST became the steel bridge that carried the arsenal of democracy straight to Hitler's doorstep. Before the LST, amphibious warfare had a grim reputation. History was littered with failed landings and catastrophic losses. From the ancient world to the First World War, military doctrine agreed on one thing: a frontal assault against a defended beach was close to suicide. The most infamous example was the Gallipoli campaign of 1915. There, Allied soldiers were cut down in horrifying numbers as they tried to row ashore under fire. The lesson seemed clear. Direct beach assaults didn't work. After Gallipoli, the world's major navies reached a firm conclusion. If you wanted to land an army, you had to capture a major port, a place with docks, cranes, and infrastructure capable of unloading heavy equipment. Beaches were for infantry at best, not for tanks and artillery. This belief hardened into doctrine and remained unchallenged for decades. By 1940, that doctrine had become a strategic trap. The Germans understood it perfectly. Across occupied Europe, they transformed every major port into a fortress, bristling with concrete bunkers, heavy guns, and demolition charges. If an invasion came, those ports would either be defended to the last man or destroyed entirely. Attacking a port meant attacking the enemy at their strongest and most predictable point. For the Allies, this posed a brutal reality. The accepted method of invasion was no longer viable. To defeat Germany, the Allies needed to do something revolutionary. They had to bypass the ports altogether. They needed to land tanks, trucks, and artillery anywhere along hundreds of miles of open coastline. They needed to turn beaches into ports. In short, they had to solve the puzzle of the beach. The driving force behind this effort was Winston Churchill. In 1940, after the evacuation from Dunkirk, Britain faced a sobering truth. While most of its soldiers escaped, nearly all of their heavy equipment, tanks, trucks, guns, had been left behind. Churchill became obsessed with the problem of returning to Europe properly equipped. He personally wrote memoranda calling for the creation of ocean-going vessels capable of carrying tanks and unloading them directly onto a beach. These ships, he believed, would be essential to any future invasion. British engineers began experimenting almost immediately. Early designs, such as the Boxer-class landing ships, showed promise, but were limited in size and capability. A more creative solution followed when Britain converted 3 shallow draft oil tankers originally built for Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela. These modified ships, designated the first LSTs-1S, featured large bow doors and a ramp system that allowed vehicles to drive directly ashore. They proved the concept was viable, but they were an improvised stopgap, not a scalable solution. Britain's shipbuilding industry was already stretched to its limits by the Battle of the Atlantic. Escort vessels, submarines, and merchant ships took priority. To build hundreds of specialized landing ships, Britain would need help. There was only one country capable of producing such vessels in the required numbers. In late 1941, a British delegation traveled to Washington with a challenge that bordered on impossible. The problem they presented was a paradox of naval engineering. A ship crossing the Atlantic needed a deep draft to remain stable in rough seas. But to land on a gently sloping beach, it needed an extremely shallow draft. Conventional wisdom said you couldn't have both. Solving that contradiction would change the course of the war. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. At the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships, a civilian naval architect named John C. Niedermeyer took on the challenge. Over the course of a single weekend, he sketched a radical solution. His design was a large, flat-bottomed ship equipped with an extensive system of ballast tanks and powerful pumps. This system would allow the ship to change its draft depending on the situation, deep in the open ocean, shallow at the beach. During an ocean crossing, the ballast tanks would be flooded with thousands of tons of seawater. This extra weight forced the ship lower into the water, giving it the stability needed to survive Atlantic storms. As the ship approached land, the pumps would rapidly empty the forward ballast tanks. The bow would rise dramatically, reducing the draft at the front of the ship from nearly 14 feet to less than 4. But Niedermeyer added one final stroke of brilliance. The ballast tanks at the stern remained full. This kept the propellers and rudders submerged, allowing the ship to maintain control and pull itself free after unloading. It was, in effect, a mechanical transformer, a ship that could alter its own physical behavior to match the mission. Combined with massive bow doors and a deployable ramp, the vessel didn't merely arrive at the beach. It became part of it, forming a temporary steel pier that allowed tanks and trucks to roll directly onto enemy soil. This design became the LST-2, and it was engineered with mass production in mind. Its boxy, angular hull avoided complex curves and could be built using simple welding techniques rather than time-consuming riveting. This allowed shipyards to employ workers with minimal training, a critical advantage in a total war economy. In one of the most remarkable industrial achievements of the war, the United States didn't limit LST construction to coastal shipyards. These ships were built deep inland, in places like Seneca, Illinois, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, hundreds of miles from the ocean. Once completed, they were launched sideways into rivers and floated down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico for final fitting and sea trials. This improvised fleet became known as the Cornfield Navy. The scale was staggering. The first LSTs took over 240 days to build. By the end of the war, production time had been reduced to roughly 80 days. More than 1,000 LSTs were constructed, turning America's rivers, factories, and workforce into a single integrated shipyard. This was the arsenal of democracy made real. The LST proved its worth during the Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943. For the first time, American tanks and heavy equipment rolled directly from ships onto enemy beaches in large numbers. Axis defenders, accustomed to seeing infantry arrive first and armor much later, were caught off guard. The concept worked. At Normandy, the LST earned its place in history. These ships were not part of the initial assault. That dangerous task fell to smaller landing craft. Instead, LSTs waited offshore until parts of the beach were secured. Then they made their slow, deliberate approach. With a top speed of barely 12 knots, they were easy targets for German artillery. The nickname, Large, Slow Target, was no joke. Crews paid for it in blood. But once an LST grounded itself on the sand, everything changed. Each ship could carry nearly 20 Sherman tanks on its main deck, along with dozens of trucks, jeeps, and supplies stacked above. Internal ramps allowed vehicles to move quickly from deck to shore. For days and weeks after D-Day, before the artificial Mulberry harbors were fully operational, LSTs formed the backbone of Allied logistics. They ran a continuous shuttle, ensuring the beachhead could not be crushed. In the Pacific, the LST's impact was even more decisive. Island after island lacked ports entirely. Coral reefs, jungles, and volcanic beaches offered nothing but obstacles. The LST made them irrelevant. It delivered tanks to Saipan, artillery to Iwo Jima, and bulldozers that carved airfields out of bare ground. Without it, the island-hopping campaign would have been impossible. The design was so effective that it endured long after World War II ended. LSTs served through Korea and Vietnam, with some remaining active into the 1990s. Even today, the basic concept, an ocean-going vessel capable of delivering vehicles directly onto a shore, remains central to amphibious warfare. The LST was never elegant. It was slow, vulnerable, and visually unimpressive, but it solved an impossible problem. It represented pragmatic engineering at its finest, backed by unmatched industrial power. It was the unsung keystone of Allied victory. Without it, there could have been no D-Day, no island-hopping campaign, and no liberation of Europe. It was the blunt, workmanlike ship that carried the armies of freedom onto the shores of tyranny.